So first, let me apologize that I didn't get this episode out sooner. You're going to notice that the audio in spots is kind of rough, and that's due to some bad internet connections. So I was really working this audio over trying to clean it up as best as I could, and that's why it's a few days late. However, despite some rough patches, this episode is one of the most important I think I've done to date. On this episode, I have on Moroni Jessop. Now, normally this is the spot in the show where I tell everyone a little bit about my guest, but let's be honest, it's Moroni Jessop. Everyone in fundamentalism knows who he is. Anyway, he came on and we talked about the history of and the changes that were made to the temple ordinances. Now, about the last half hour of this interview, Moroni and I end up talking about some pretty controversial topics. I'm sure the last segment of this podcast will end up ruffling some feathers. In fact, this may turn some folks off to the podcast entirely. Now, I hope this doesn't happen, but I told you, the listener, early on that I was going to be truthful with you in my search for truth and authenticity. I have counted the cost of releasing this episode and know this may cost me, but to stay true to who I am, I feel like it's something that had to happen. So buckle up, because that's next on this edition of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure if anyone would really listen. Now, to my surprise, this thing has taken on a life of its own. And that's all due to you, the listener, spending your time here with me, and it means a great deal to me. Now, as a husband and father, I'm keenly aware of how important time is. It feels like there's just never enough of it. So when you are spending your time here listening to this podcast, I feel a responsibility to never waste your time. In that spirit, as this podcast has grown, I feel like I need to do you, the listener, justice. I want to continue to produce good content and upgrade the audio quality. That takes better equipment and better software, and that all takes money. Now, I've tried to advertise, but you'd be surprised. There's not a lot of people wanting to advertise on a Mormon Fundamentalist podcast. I know, surprising, right? Now, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do that one of two ways. The first is go over to MormonRenegade.com and hit the donate tab. There you can make a one-time donation, or you can go ahead and set it up to be a monthly recurring donation. Your choice entirely. Now, option number two, because I'm a capitalist, if you want to head on over to MormonRenegade.com, click on the store button, you're going to find that we've got some new swag out. We got some t-shirts, we have a tote, we have cell phone cases, water bottles, coffee cups. We got a bunch of stuff, and more is going to be on the way. So, if you feel like that's something you could do, again, head on over to Mormon Renegade and check all that stuff out. If you're not in that position to do so, I completely understand. We're all squeezed right now with high gas prices and high inflation. So even if you can't, please keep listening and maybe keep the podcast in your prayers so we can continue to grow, produce good content, and better audio quality. Thank you. Well, Moroni, I'll tell you what, man. I can't appreciate you enough being on. I mean, I followed you for years on Facebook and listened to some of your talks, and they were some of the best. And I feel like in some ways you're a guy that's near and dear to my heart, right? Because I'm a little unconventional like you are, right? I'm gonna drop the swear word, and I'm going to be a little rebellious at times, and it works out really well that you're on, and I'm just super stoked that you're here.
Well, thanks. I'm really glad you invited me, and I'm always surprised when I hear that people have followed stuff that I do, because a lot of times it doesn't feel like people are listening or hearing the things I have to say. So I always appreciate hearing that people are hearing some of the podcasts I've done, some of the posts I've made, and of course, I knew who you were. So I felt very fortunate that I got an invite from you to be on here. So.
Well, I sure appreciate that. So as I reached out to you before and brought up the subject of the temple and the temple changes and the changes to those ordinances, I couldn't think of a better guy to do it because, look, I'm just going to shoot you straight. All the stuff you do is pretty well thought out. So I feel like you were the perfect guy for this episode. So,
well, thank you. I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is very well thought out, but I'll give it a shot.
I think you're going to do great. So real quick, give us just kind of a brief history, if you will, on the temple ceremony from like Joseph Smith to Brigham Young.
Okay, so first of all, if you're going to talk about temple ordinances, you have to start with Kirtland, and but things really weren't developed then. Well, you have to go back even further. You have to go back to Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, came from the Campbellite movement, and they quoted the scriptures. They talked about receiving an endowment from on high. But Sidney Rigdon at that time was referring more to like a confirmation that you receive after baptism. For him, that was the endowment that you receive, and for some restorationist organizations like the Community of Christ, that's still the endowment. You're endowed from on high. But Joseph Smith, it's recorded in some of the early Doctrine and Covenants sections, like I think 43 or 44, that they were supposed to build the temple in Kirtland. And when they were to build the temple in Kirtland, then the Lord would provide a greater endowment than what they had previously received.
Okay, let me stop you. Can I stop you there for a second? Because I'm going to ask you some questions here about, in your estimation, you're talking about Sidney Rigdon and the Campbellites and being endowed with power from on high. Is that something that we carry forward as Mormons now, or are they? Because you hear that a lot, but in that time frame, the 1830s and 40s, are they talking about something different than the temple ceremony?
Yeah, it definitely evolved into something greater. But I think that sometimes as Latter-day Saints, we're a little dismissive of the power of the confirmation, that we're given the gift of the Holy Ghost when we're confirmed members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, I think that we shouldn't ever downplay the importance of that as being part of an initiatory process, I guess you should say. My dad used to say that the endowment occurs in increments. That starting from the basic all the way to the highest ordinances of the temple, it's all one endowment. It's not necessarily codified into smaller pieces. It's all part of one big mass endowment, I guess you could say. And I think that like Orson Pratt bears me out on that. I read in Times and Seasons where Orson Pratt defined the sealing keys of Elijah as the authority for any man to perform any priesthood ordinance from the beginning, from baptism, all the way to the highest ordinances. Those are all that's what encompasses the sealing keys of Elijah. And, when you look at it in kind of that kind of holistic perspective, then Doctrine and Covenants section 2 makes a little more sense, where it says that, behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by Elijah that will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest the whole earth be utterly wasted at his coming. So in essence, the keys for every single ordinance have to be actively engaged upon this earth at the time of the second coming. Otherwise, as it says in the scriptures, this whole world will be wasted. So, I guess, people refer to what happened in Kirtland as like a pre-endowment, but it was a vital and an integral part of what was to come, say, in Nauvoo and beyond that. But Kirtland is where they began doing the washing of feet, which was a vital part of the endowment process. One that I think a lot of Latter-day Saints don't know that much about anymore. But, that was for the cleansing of the blood and sins of this generation. And that was one of the first temple endowments, something that occurred right inside of the temple. And of course, you have later leaders like Joseph Fielding Smith, who wrote in, I think, what was it, A Work and a Wonder, where he talks about that the purpose of the Kirtland Temple was to establish a holy place where beings from heaven could come and deliver further keys unto Joseph, because we know at this point that he didn't have all the authority to perform all the ordinances that had to come in increments.
Okay. So when Sidney Rigdon talks about uh, being endowed with power from on high, does he have the idea of temple work going on, or is he talking about something different?
I don't think he had a clue.
Okay.
But for that matter, I don't think Joseph did either. But
No.
Joseph knew enough to know that there was more coming. In
Okay.
fact, he said that on several occasions that there was more that was coming after that. So, but I don't think I don't think Joseph had it in his mind yet what was going to take place in the endowment ceremony in the years to come.
Okay. So how would you classify then the Kirtland Temple? What in your mind, what was the Kirtland Temple? Because they're not performing endowment sessions or sealings or those sorts of things. They're doing a type and a shadow, if I'm understanding you correctly,
It's
with
like a
with
precursor.
washing. Okay, with washing feet. Okay, so that's definitely kind of a precursor.
Yes,
Okay,
in my estimation, it is. Yeah.
and I think that's probably pretty accurate, right? Because you, you're seeing a place where you can congregate with the entire congregation and then performing some other ordinances. So that definitely holds water, so to speak, that it was a preparatory kind of temple.
Yeah. So then, we know the troubles that happened in Kirtland, and they wound up losing access to that particular temple. And I've often wondered what would have happened in the Kirtland temple if if they had been able to keep it. I wonder if we would have seen the evolvement of the endowment further inside of the Kirtland temple. But of course, we'll never know because then they had financial problems in Kirtland. They had the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, and it wasn't, I think, until they were driven out of Missouri and relocated in Nauvoo that they started thinking, they had a little period of peace there where they started thinking about temple work again and started construction of the Nauvoo temple. And of course, the Nauvoo temple had another precursor, which was the red brick store. And, I'm sure that a lot of people have heard of that Joseph started administering washing of the feet and other ordinances. He had joined, the Freemasons and had been exposed to some of those ideas and gradually started introducing his own version of Freemasonry in the upper floor of the red brick store, and did washing of feet, started the second anointings. All of those things that started to flesh out a little bit in Nauvoo in the red brick store.
So real quick, I want to go back to something with that you said just a few minutes ago about um, the red brick store era. He's not performing full endowments up there, or is he?
Well, he was introducing washings and anointings. Well, they I have to go back. They did washings and anointings in the Kirtland Temple too, but he continued the custom of washings and anointings in the red brick store. He also introduced signs, tokens, and penalties. So it was starting to kind of flesh out. I don't think it was until the actual Nauvoo ceremony in the temple that we started seeing something that resembles the endowment that we have today. But yeah, one interesting thing I always read from the times I was a kid, how they would anoint themselves. They would wash and anoint themselves with like things like whiskey.
Right.
Can you imagine that?
Well, yeah. I mean, it sounds funny to us today because of kind of the time that we're in, right? But
Yeah,
as you look at it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because look, hygiene wasn't as great back then as it was today, right? I mean, you may not take a bath all winter, and so if you're going to someplace holy, you better be clean, right? And
right.
and and so yeah, it sounds funny until you put it into historical context, and it makes kind of sense. I want to ask you about something else because you brought up another point that I want to kind of flesh out here a little bit, and that is the
Okay.
link between the temple ceremony and masonry. What is your understanding of how that process comes to be? Because I think if we're fair and if we're honest, we have to say that that had some sort of impact on Joseph that kind of started those wheels turning, right?
Yeah. Of course, tell when I explain things, I always have to give like an anecdote.
Right.
So
No, it's good.
yeah, I mean, so when I was young, I was an exchange student in Belgium, and the family that I stayed with, my host family, they were Freemasons. And when I was there, I had no idea what Freemasons were. But I went to a lot of the Freemason gatherings. I went to like picnics with the local Masons in the Ardennes forest and things like that. But one night, the father of the host family that I was staying with took me aside, and in broken English, and I spoke broken French, he spoke broken English, and but between the two of us, we were able to communicate. And he said, he says, I noticed that when people are asking you if you're Mormon, that you're hesitating. And of course I was, because everyone in Belgium, when they found out I was Mormon, and I'm only like 18 years old, they're trying to give me the word of wisdom test by offering me wine. And I started getting annoyed by when every time somebody was asking me if I was Mormon, because I knew they were going to offer me alcohol. And then so he says, I noticed that you're hesitating when people are asking you if you're Mormon. He says, you need to be proud that you're Mormon. And then he said, me, Freemason, you, Mormon. And then he goes, Freemason, respect Mormon. And of course, that didn't mean anything to me at 18 years old, but obviously he knew that there was a connection. So he was trying to express an affinity towards me because we believed in something similar.
That's
And
awesome.
then
No, you're not just Mormon. You were, if I'm not mistaken, you were raised in fundamentalism, right?
no,
Oh
I
no,
was
you
actually
weren't.
raised in the LDS Church.
Okay, I
So
apologize.
just to clarify a little bit about my family, so my great grandfather was one of the founding members of the fundamentalist organization. He lived with Lauren Woolley as a ranch hand, and so he was involved in the movement right from the beginning. But my grandmother uh, took my grandfather back to the church. She wasn't having any of this fundamentalist stuff, and so they went back to the church. And then he instructed my dad on a lot of fundamentalist principles.
Okay.
But my dad grew up in the church. He served a mission for the church, but his dad died when he was 14, before he was able to find out very much about his fundamentalist background. And my dad was just told by my grandmother and my grandmother's family that polygamists were lecherous old men and that they were evil. And my dad, being a super missionary, when he started going to BYU, came across some of his Jessop relatives that he had never met before. And being the super missionary that he was, he decided to try to prove them wrong. And he started spending all of his time out of class in the special collections section of BYU library. And he became converted there. So at age 20, when I was 20, my dad basically for years got chewed out by the church and was told to stay quiet and everything. But when I was 20, the whole family got excommunicated. We had somebody in our ward who was kind of high up and in cahoots and on really good terms with the general authorities, and he wasn't having any of this quasi fundamentalist stuff in his ward. So he requested from Salt Lake to have every one of us excommunicated, and we were all cut off, all the way down to my 13-year-old sister.
Wow.
Of course, from there we all became fundamentalists. We were in the AUB for about 5 years, and then most of the time after that we spent as independents. And but anyway,
it must have been tough, dude.
Yeah, it's been tough, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more later.
Right.
But anyway, so then when I was, we grew up in Arizona, and when I was 20 years old, I decided, after my excommunication, I decided to move to Salt Lake to be closer to other fundamentalists. And I was going to Salt Lake Community College, and I decided to attend institute classes. So I was attending institute, and there was this guy that was like, obviously, I mean, I didn't know then, but he was obviously an ex-Mormon, an ex-Mo. And he would argue with the seminary teacher or the institute teacher at every opportunity that he could. And he finally, I wasn't giving the textbook answers. And so he leaned over and one day and he said, what kind of Mormon are you? And I said, I'm a Mormon fundamentalist. And he goes, oh. And I remember specifically, there was somebody sitting by me who picked up their books and moved across the room from me. And
they don't want to be catching that virus.
And then halfway through class, this guy goes, I just realized what a fundamentalist is. And so after class, he wanted to talk to me. And so we're talking, and he said, Joseph Smith got the idea for the temple ceremony from the Freemasons, from the Masons. And, me not knowing what a Mason is, I'm thinking like brick Masons. He got the idea to build a temple from brick Masons. I'm like, it didn't make sense to me. So it wasn't until after I was endowed that I realized that the endowment is indeed connected to Freemasonry. And so I started to study from that point on. I started studying everything I could about Freemasonry, short of becoming a Mason myself. I'm not a Mason myself, but I have several friends who are. I've studied a lot of their rituals and traditions, and there is a definite connection between the endowment and Freemasonry. I mean, it's evident to anybody who studies it. And people like Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were of the opinion that the endowment is true Freemasonry, and that Freemasonry was simply an archetype of a much older tradition from which our endowment descends and is the spiritual heir of that particular tradition.
Cool. Real quick, you're breaking up a little bit. You want to try and maybe put that mic back on, or?
Yeah. Let me see.
I can't say breaking up. It's kind of gurgly.
Yeah, I had the problem last time I did this.
Okay.
And I'm going to turn it on, and you just tell me if it sounds clearer.
Well, you sound fine at times, and at other times it just goes gurgly.
Okay, hold on.
Sound good?
I don't think it's on quite yet.
Yeah, see, there you were just gurgly.
Okay, let me see here. Let me connect my Bluetooth.
I'm so sorry, man.
Oh, that's all right. So how much of it did you miss?
Not much. You can get we get 99% of it. It's just every once in a while it just goes gargly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not connecting for some reason. But I mean, we can continue, and I can try to fiddle this with this while we talk.
Okay. So, do you get the sense that Joseph sees the Masonic ceremony and then he starts receiving revelation? Is that kind of what you, as you've been able to piece it together, is that kind of what you sense?
I would say so, because I mean, we're talking like he started introducing elements of the endowment, like the signs and tokens. He started introducing those within 4 weeks of becoming a Mason. But there were others, like his brother Hiram, who had been a Mason for years. And you know, I don't know. I've heard, I've read other books that say that and I don't know. This is just speculation, but that Joseph's family um, had connection to like the Rosicrucians, and I don't know. I've never seen any evidence of that, but there's I've read a whole book that was making that argument before.
I think a lot of times people think that when they find out that there is, some similarities between like the temple endowment and then masonry, I think people automatically jump to the conclusion that, oh, Joseph Smith ripped this off from the Masons, so to speak. And
yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that argument, and that really doesn't mean, when people make that argument, that doesn't really mean that much to me.
No,
Because so what if the Lord directed him to that? It he wasn't plagiarizing anything in my book. Like a
no,
lot of
no, I
assume.
don't think he was. And realistically, and you could probably speak to this more than I could, but there was a quote that I had read years ago or heard years ago, back in the Know Your Religion days in the LDS Church, if you remember those, and
Yeah,
which was that Joseph had made some sort of statement about, the Masonic ceremonies were somewhat corrupted, but they had some sort of line. And if you follow, Masonry back, it doesn't have a real firm start date. I mean, there's people who make assumptions, but it's an old system. Um,
yeah,
and so
like,
if that was the case, if there was something, echoes of the past, so to speak, right? Well, if Joseph's a seer, which we all raise our hands to the square and attest that he is, we would expect to see that him being able to lean back and kind of be directed by the Spirit and revelation and say, oh, wait a second, there's more to this, right? So I think I'll just speak for myself. I think it's an intellectually a lazy way of explaining some of those similarities between masonry and the endowment, right? I don't think
yeah,
there's a lot of thought given there.
yeah. But I've heard a lot of Masons and Mormon Masons who have argued that, well, this Masonry started, in the early 1700s. But if you talk to anybody who's studied multiple esoteric traditions, there's elements of Masonry that are a lot older than the early 1700s, and that's undeniable. There's elements in there that are much older. Now, I don't know. I don't know personally that it goes all the way back to Solomon's Temple, like Brigham Young claimed, but it certainly goes back a lot further than than early 1700s in Scotland or wherever.
Right.
There's so much older things in Masonry, and so whether these things were passed on to Joseph Smith through his family or through the Freemasons, obviously he recognized something of value in there. And was he directed by the Lord? I believe so. And so I don't have any problem with there being a connection to
Yeah,
Freemasonry at all.
I don't either. So we kind of veered off on a tangent there. We were in Nauvoo. Joseph's in the red brick store. He's starting to um, do the washing of feet there again.
Yes.
Let's continue with that progression, because I think it's in Nauvoo that we see a real crystallization of something that today we as Mormons would recognize as the endowment.
Yeah, and I mean, right from the get-go, he takes 9 men and performs the second anointing on them as well on the red brick store. Basically, he washes them and then anoints them to not just become kings and priests, but to be kings and priests. And shortly after he anoints these men, then he does the same thing, like within days, for their wives, and seals the wives to these men as queens and priestesses as well. So, we start to see a lot of stuff starting to take shape, at this time period before the temple is built.
So, and I believe it's during this time as well that the concept of baptisms for the dead come forward, right?
Yes, the first baptisms for the dead took place actually in the Nauvoo temple. So they're not at this point, they're not doing full on endowments for the dead. That doesn't take place until St. George, Utah. But we're seeing definitely the concept starting to evolve. And then, of course, Joseph Smith was martyred in 1844. We just passed the 178th anniversary of his death 2 days ago. And after that, the Nauvoo temple is being completed. And before they complete it, they start doing endowments in the attic. They partition off the room with curtains, and they have like one section devoted to be the garden room, the other one to be the telestial room, and they decorate it with plants and everything. And I think it's kind of funny, that I've been in endowment ceremonies that are kind of set up, temporarily like that, with sheets hanging across rooms and everything, but so that's what they're doing. They start performing endowments, and at this time, shortly after the dedication, they are being driven out of Nauvoo. Brigham Young is getting ready to leave, and but there are a lot of people there at the temple who are petitioning for their endowments, and so Brigham Young delays leaving for Utah that year by 2 weeks, and they are working in the temple round the clock doing endowments. Brigham Young is documenting in his journal that he's doing endowments until 3:30 in the morning, and they did like 5,500 endowments in that 2-week period. So they're busy, and but I've always been fascinated by the Nauvoo temple period, because it's we don't really have any written scripts of what they were doing. The closest that we have are journals of people who described in detail what they went through, what they experienced when they went through the endowment. By then, they are doing the passion play, so to speak, of Adam and Eve, kind of like what we do in our endowment now. But it's not scripted. They have basic things that they do. They introduce the robes of the priesthood. They introduce the signs, tokens, and penalties. But it's extemporaneous. It differs from session to session. And I always used to wonder, why don't we have any written accounts, written scripts of the Nauvoo temple? Because there was none. They were winging it. They were like ad-libbing. So you could have Lucifer saying completely different things during one session as opposed to another one. And it wasn't until they got to Utah that the endowment became codified. And so the temple workers used to just pass down the endowment by oral tradition from worker to worker. And when Brigham Young codified the endowment, they were basically trying to remember and write down what they had done in Nauvoo previously. So, I remember there's one account that whoever was playing Lucifer during a particular session was so scary in the way that he portrayed Lucifer that he had people quaking in their shoes. They were so afraid of him. He was so realistic in his portrayal, and I kind of like that, because I'm like a drama nerd, and the fact that they were actually acting, as a fundamentalist, a lot of the endowment, it drives me bananas. At one point, I don't anymore, but at one point I used to have the endowment memorized front to back, totally memorized. And we'd have endowment sessions, and our temple workers are reading. They have a white notebook in their hand as they're going from room to room, reading their parts instead of memorizing them. And that used to just drive me nuts. And the other thing is that they would portray their parts without any degree of emotion or passion. And the thing is that the endowment is a passion play. And so if it's a passion play, there needs to be passion in it somewhere. So, I really appreciated reading that story that this Lucifer was so authentic in his performance that he scared people.
And I think that's something that is super cool to know, right? Because I think whether you're coming from an LDS background or whether you're coming even from a fundamentalist background, these today it's very regimented and codified in how it's done, which can be a good thing too, right? Because I mean it's designed in such a way that it makes sense, so to speak, right? So I'm sure
Yeah,
in the ad-libbing portion of that you could get off on some pretty strange tangents, but
yeah,
at the same time, like you're saying, you're losing a little bit, right? I don't know. That's some of the thoughts I have. So real quick, Joseph knows he's gonna die, right? I mean, I think we all
yeah.
know that. And he gives Brigham Young a very specific charge, right? Concerning
Yes,
the
he
endowment.
does.
And what
He
was that charge?
Well, he commissioned him to be the one to. He said that, in essence, I'm paraphrasing. He said the endowment isn't perfect the way we have it now. He says, but I'm leaving it up to you to perfect it. To do whatever you need to perfect it. So he gave Brigham the commission to complete the endowment. In other words, So so the Saints go to Utah, and they start building the temples over there. They're specifically working on the St. George Temple, and Brigham Young oversees a team of writers who actually write the endowment down in a specific manner. And I want to go into a little story as to why this is important. So I went through a couple of endowments while I was visiting a particular fundamentalist community, and I'm not going to say which one
Right.
because I respect them and I don't want to disparage what they're doing. But I mentioned earlier that I have the endowment. I used to have the endowment memorized frontwards and backwards, and so I go to this endowment ceremony, and it's all mixed up. Everything in the endowment is there, but it's out of order the way they presented it. And it kind of, for somebody who's kind of like slightly OCD like me, it was grating on me to have the endowment all mixed up, and this line moved over here, that part moved over here, things moved out of order. And what they were claiming was that they had the Manti version of the endowment, that the version in Manti was a little bit different than the one in Salt Lake. And so I thought, well, honestly, what I thought, some of the people in that community had come from uh, Jim Harmson's group, the TLC.
Okay, gotcha.
And I still don't know for sure, but I was willing to bet that they got their version of the endowment from Jim Harmson. And,
Okay.
you know, but they were saying, "Oh, what do you think of our endowment? It flows better, doesn't it? It flows better." And I'm thinking, "No, it doesn't. It doesn't flow better at all." And so I did research, and I found some pioneer journals where we're talking like around 1894. There was a man in the church who recorded in his journal that he attended endowments in St. George, Salt Lake, Logan, and Manti, and he testified that all of them were the same ordinance that was done in the Salt Lake Temple. So to me, that was evidence that this endowment that I went through was one of Jim Harmson's alterations, and you know, and that's one of the reasons why Brigham Young uh, commissioned people, specifically L. John Nuttall, to start writing the endowment out because he wanted a singular ordinance for all of the temples because he was afraid that one temple might decide to pervert the endowment. So he wanted something uniform for each temple.
I got you. Yeah, I think the words that Joseph used to Brigham was, you know, systematize and organize, right? So
Yeah,
you got the feeling from that statement that Joseph's saying, look, it's all here, but it's not perfect yet. And that's your job is to put it in its proper place, so to speak, right? Make it flow.
exactly.
So let me ask you this question, because I think this question has some repercussions behind it, Moroni, which is, do you think at the time that Brigham Young finishes the process of, quote, systematizing and organizing the endowment, do you feel like that that is the culmination, that, hey, that's where it's supposed to be and that's what it's supposed to look like?
Yes. Yes and no. I mean, there are, and we can get into this later, but there are things like the oath of vengeance that I think were particular to Brigham's time and not necessarily our own. Uh, I don't have a problem with additions being made down to the being made to the endowment as long as it's number one revealed, number two necessary. But one thing that I disagree with that happened after Brigham's death was, expediency, political expediency being used to soften the endowment. And to me, that's subtracting from the endowment. If somebody has more to add to it and it's provided by revelation, I don't have a problem with it. But when you're whittling away at the ordinances just because you want to be more palatable to the world, then that's when I have a problem with it.
Well, and to be fair, I think we've seen that for quite a while now as Mormons, right? In general,
Oh, it's like nonstop.
especially in the LDS Church, right? I mean, I think at some point this thing's going to be a drive-through there, where you can just go through for expediency, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
where okay, so you get the feeling, okay, Brigham, Joseph Smith has this revealed. It's kind of taking shape, as early as Kirtland, but really starts to crystallize in Nauvoo. The Saints head out west. Brigham tells Nuttall, let's get this thing where it's supposed to be. Let's fulfill Joseph's charge to me and get this thing where it needs to be. How long does the endowment, as we know it, and all the temple ordinances, how long do they continue in the way they should before you start seeing changes creep in?
Well, I think there were alterations as early as like 1893. They started kind of trying to soften things. I think that one of the first things they did was to take out Brigham's lecture at the Veil. They still had a lecture at the Veil, but it wasn't Brigham's at that point.
Right.
And I think that it was Joseph F. Smith started disagreeing with the teaching of the Adam God doctrine.
Right.
And as we know, Brigham's lecture at the Veil is all about the Adam God doctrine. And still, to this day, if people want to know about the Adam God doctrine, I'll direct them to like a website that I know that has the lecture at the Veil printed. And I'm like, yeah, read this for yourself because it explains it fairly succinctly. The Adam God doctrine was so important to the saints back then and to Brigham that it was part of the endowment, undeniably.
And what's interesting, and so you're talking to a guy that 2 year, I guess three now, I can't remember. Anyway, who's not too far removed from the LDS Church, right? I'm a guy who converted to the LDS Church, and
Yeah.
now I'm a fundamentalist, right? But what you see is that you know what they're doing once you know what used to be taught, right? And so
Yeah.
Adam God is huge. That's one of those things that really redefines, in my opinion, the mainstream church in a big way. but it's there all throughout those higher ordinances of the temple, right? It's
Yeah.
there through the endowment, especially. And so, if you're trying to get rid of that doctrine, it makes sense. If that's where it's taught the most, is in the temple, you now have to go to work in trying to gently remove that without causing too much angst of the membership. The
Yeah.
problem is that once you understand the Adam God doctrine, I don't think you can totally get rid of it out of the endowment. There's always going to be
No.
some remnant there, right? And as soon as you understand the Adam God doctrine really well, you're going to be able to pick it out really quickly.
Yeah. And I think that's one of your benefits that I don't have. I was cut off from the LDS church before I went through the endowment. I was like at that missionary age where I got excommunicated uh, before I was able to get endowed in the church. So I don't have the benefit of you of seeing the LDS endowment, and I've never seen the movies that they
Oh,
show. And and I'm sure they're online. I'm sure that if I wanted to, I could, but I've just never taken that opportunity yet. So
yeah, no, it's been interesting just in my time, just in my 20 years I was in the LDS church. I saw massive changes, right? And it always did bug me, right? I mean, like, look, if you start doing the math and this thing's about making covenants, right? Well, why won't my kids end up making the same covenants as I do, right? And
right,
so that threw in a lot of questioning, if you will. So as early as 1893, we start seeing trying to take out the lecture at the Veil.
yeah,
What are some of the successive ones? Because in my study, and maybe you might have a different opinion, but in my study, it seems like the changes came really slowly and really softly. And then in
yeah.
about the last 20 years, it's like, okay, now we're going to put our foot on the accelerator and completely gut this thing.
Well, I think that during the Reed Smoot hearings,
Mm-hmm.
um, which of course we know that he was being having a congressional trial because of his association with the church and plural marriage. The endowment became something that was under congressional scrutiny because they were trying to find any evidence that Reed Smoot was a traitor to the United States. And one of the things that they focus on was the oath of vengeance. And of course, the oath of vengeance was where they promised to never cease praying for the Lord to avenge the blood of the martyred righteous dead unto however many generations, third or fourth generation, you know. And, if you look at it in context, the saints went through a lot in Missouri and in losing their prophet. And so, of course, they're going to pray for, his blood to be avenged. But that was part of the temple endowment until Congress brought up the wording of the oath, and they were trying to put Reed Smoot on the hot seat. And it was shortly after that that was one of the first things that Heber J. Grant revised was when he became president, was removing the oath of vengeance. And Heber J. Grant did a bunch more. The penalties were a little bit more gruesome, and Heber J. Grant kind of softened that a little bit. And then one of the ones that I found that was interesting that, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this.
Yeah.
Lucifer, the choir. When Lucifer has the pastor who directs the congregation to sing, they in the old days they actually used to have a temple choir that would sing the song, and then but one of the changes Heber J. Grant made is that Lucifer is directing the preacher is directing the congregation, the people who were recipients of the temple endowment that day, to sing. And one of the things when I was in the AUB that we used to discuss was that it was a form of test, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it was a form of test to see who would follow Lucifer's servant, the preacher, and sing along, and who would remain silent. And there would be men who would brag, well, I didn't sing, And I honestly can't remember my first endowment well enough to know whether I sang or not. I think I probably did, but it's kind of funny that that's how they interpreted it. And ultimately they discontinued the existence of the preacher altogether because it was offensive to, mainstream Christianity. But then one of the other changes that occurred around 1923 was the alteration of the temple garment. They created what was called the street garment, which was to the elbows instead of all the way to the wrist, and to the knees instead of all the way to the ankle. And this was the garment that you were to wear in your everyday life. But then when you would go back to the temple, you would wear the long garment, the temple garment once again. And that came about during that time period.
So there was actually two garments that were used during that time.
Yeah. And I remember my parents talking about that because my parents were endowed in the early 1960s. And so they had both the temple garment and the street garment. And I think it was like around 1975, 76, somewhere, where they totally discontinued the temple garment in favor of the shorter street garment, which was now just your garments, not your street garment.
That's interesting. So let me ask you this. Did that take place during Heber J. Grant's time, or was that during Joseph F. Smith's time?
No, I think the alteration of the garment, the street garment, was 1923, and I'm pretty sure that was during Heber J. Grant's tenure.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, good old Heber J. Grant.
He seems to be a focal point of where things really start to go off the rails a little bit. So that takes us through that 1923 period. What are some of the fallouts that you think you can see in the changes that were implemented up to that point?
Well, if we're going to talk about Heber J. Grant, I read in Rutger Clausen's biography that both Rutger Clausen and Heber J. Grant were part of, when they were young, when they were teenagers, they were part of a movement, a literary movement that was taking place in Salt Lake at the time among the youth, where they would get together, read poetry, which I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with having a literary society, but there was a marked attitude with this group of young people. They were embarrassed by plural marriage, even though both Rutger Clausen and Heber J. Grant became polygamists. They were both embarrassed. That group of people were embarrassed by the principle. They were trying to dress in Paris-style fashions. I think that they were a group of people that yearned for the world and yearned for the attention of the world. And I think that attitude prevailed with Heber J. Grant all through, his adulthood, into his apostleship, and ultimately into the presidency of the church. Of course, we know that he's the one that waged war the most on fundamentalists.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think a lot of what Heber J. Grant did was trying to become more palatable to the world and to show the world that, hey, we're not like that anymore. We don't embrace this principle anymore. And he was trying to make a point. He was trying to impress people, I think. And along with that goes the softening and the whittling away of our temple ceremonies in order to be more favorable to outsiders, because a less bizarre endowment means more converts. I mean, there's no other way that you can put it. They want more converts, so they've the latest. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but the latest batch of changes that took place in the temple in 2019, the church didn't mince any bones about it, or they basically came right out and said that they put out a questionnaire to a certain amount of members to see how they would feel about making these changes. It wasn't revelation. It was done by committee. It was, it was done by a marketing team.
Right.
So,
right. And that's really what is the most disturbing about some of these changes, right? I'm a guy who believes in continual revelation, right? It's hard to think that you can espouse that idea of continued revelation, and then when something new comes out, just disregard it. But if you change something, like you were saying, why are we taking things away? Right?
right.
Because that doesn't make any sense with how the Lord works, right? And I believe that Joseph Smith said, if you want to see a mark of a false prophet, he will do contradictory to what the previous prophet had done. And,
Yeah.
and that's very concerning. And the other thing is that because I tend to want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, right? Even though I think he screws up tremendously, even though I think he does damage beyond repair, I'm sure that Heber J. Grant thought he was doing the right thing, right? I got to take the church from this old pioneer, bizarre thing and bring it into modernity, right? And so I have no doubt what in his mind he's thinking, okay, I'm doing a great service here. In doing that, however, he's now kicked the door down in a way that hadn't been done to that point. And if I'm wrong, correct me. That hadn't been done to that point, where now I think he set that precedence that those changes would begin to become more drastic and more frequent within the temple ceremony.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that I wonder is, what would have Heber J. Grant have done had he known how this would have snowballed, if he had seen the changes that are taking place now? You even have James E. Talmage, and Talmage is recognized as, like one of the more progressive, Orthodox, creator. He's the creator of Orthodox Mormonism. You even find quotes from Talmage saying the temple ordinances must not be changed. And, I think that they are probably rolling in their graves seeing what has happened to the church now. I mean, we live in a day and age now where according to the modern Mormon, Bruce R. McConkie is considered antiquated and almost even quasi-fundamentalist.
No, you're 100% correct. I remember the last talk I ever gave in the LDS Church. I quoted Bruce R. And I think this is a good measuring stick. When I first joined the church, right, in 1995, everyone's like, read Mormon Doctrine. You can do no better than get a copy of Mormon Doctrine. Fast forward 20-some years later, I quote Mormon Doctrine in a talk I give, and I get dragged into the bishop's office, and like, hey, we don't use that anymore. And I'm like, this is good stuff, bro. You really need to get into it, right? And he was like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. So I think you're right. I think that this just snowballed out of control.
Yeah, I agree. And and I wanted to point out one of the things that Joseph Smith said repeatedly, that where there is no change in order, and where there's, you'll have to help me with this. I'm not like my friend Sean Anderson. I can't spit quotes out just off the top of my head.
If you're looking for help from
where
me,
there's no change in ordinance, there is no change in priesthood.
Right.
So, I mean, so that, the flip side of that is where you have a change of ordinances, you have a change of priesthood. And my dad, who passed away in 2002, he didn't live to see the changes that have taken place in the church now. But he used to say that once they did away with the penalties that he said that the endowment was half a loaf. That when you went and got the endowment, all you got was half a loaf. That's how he used to refer to it. And, that was one of the major changes that came about around 1990. 1990, I mentioned that they eliminated the part of the preacher. They also eliminated Lucifer referring to popes and priests, because I guess that was offensive to popes and priests. And they dropped a lot of other things. The 5 points of fellowship. They dropped the penalties. The penalties were removed completely. And I, as you know, I circulate in a lot of Mormon circles, particularly like a lot of the Exmo circles, and with the portrayal in Under the Banner of Heaven of the penalties, and what they tried to do is they tried to foreshadow the use of penalties as something pertaining to blood atonement, and something that eventually led to the Lafferty murders. And they've tried to make it ominous, but and I wish that I had one of my friends here with me who has explained that penalties, that a covenant doesn't mean very much according to Hebraic law unless there is a blood oath attached to it. That it's the blood oath that makes the covenant stronger. And it's not supposing that you would want to have blood atonement done to you, or that you would want to do blood atonement to anyone. It's kind of like an advanced version of cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye kind of thing. Right. That you're making a covenant that I would rather have this happen to me than betray my covenants. And, it's really hard in these circles to discuss the importance of the penalties, and how much they weaken the endowment by removing those, and the only reason they removed them is because they didn't want to offend people.
Well, and I think, look, even in covenants we make with each other in business, right? If you enter into a contract with someone, you're very aware of what happens when you breach that contract, right? If you buy a house and you fail to make your payments, well, they're coming for the house. You know that there's going to be money that you owe on top of them taking your house. Same way with a car, same way with a loan, any of those things. There are penalties, so to speak, that are enacted when you breach that covenant, right? Now, as you were saying, I agree with you that doesn't mean that you're begging to be, quote, blood atoned, or that you're wanting to go do that to somebody else. It just drives home the point, right? I don't know about you. When I bought my first car as a kid, right, I was probably 18, and I'm signing my name on that dotted line. And I'll never forget this. The gentleman who sold me the car, he kind of put his hand on my wrist. He's like, understand, son, if you do not, fulfill your obligation here, all these things are going to happen to you. He listed it out. Scared me to death, right? From that point forward, I'm like, we're going to pay that thing 4 days early, right? That payment's always 4 days early because I know what's attached. Now, that's for a car. It's for a car, right? If you're taking a covenant, if you're making a covenant with God that has eternal ramifications, it makes sense that, hey, there has to be a mechanism in place to drive home how important this is, and that failure to live up to these will result in eternal consequences, not blood atonement, but eternal consequences.
Right, exactly.
And really, when you look at it, you can say it's a genius move in a lot of ways in respects to those, because it does drive home the fact you're on the hook, bro. And so you better walk up to these things right now.
Yeah, I remember that in the 90s, that there was a journalist who, it was like one of the first exposés of the temple ceremony that I came across. And I can't remember her name right offhand, but I know that she used to write for a zine called Phoenix New Times in Phoenix. And she wrote an expose of the temple, and she had several chapters dedicated to exposing the endowment. She wrote the whole endowment out verbatim and published it, and was on the bestsellers list for a couple of weeks. And I always thought that it was funny that the only part she didn't write about was where Lucifer asked, "Do you sell your tokens for money?" Because she obviously was. She was writing a sensationalist, overview of the temple, and for the sake of money, and she just neglected to put that part in there.
Yeah, see that. Yeah, that one hit close to home, right? She got right there to write that one and went, "Yeah, we're gonna leave that one out." Right? That one might hit a little too close to home. So they changed. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say they change all that stuff in 90, and 90 seems to be a benchmark year, so to speak, as far as temple changes go, right?
Right.
That's where it really, I think, kicks into high gear, right? That
Right.
Now it's a concerted effort. Where does it go from there?
Well, from there, I think in 2005, they start doing a symbolic washing and anointing instead of, an actual washing and anointing, which was bizarre to me because it was, I guess, akin to when the early Christians stopped doing baptism by immersion and started sprinkling, So, because that's essentially what the washing and anointing were, you were sprinkled and it evolved from the days in Nauvoo when they were standing in a bathtub, being full on scrubbed and washed, and then Brigham Young used to talk about being anointed so much that he had oil dripping down into his beard, and now it's just a little I don't even know how they can call it a washing and anointing anymore,
right?
So I don't know if you went through the church to see that particular change, but
So yeah, I was, when I went through, it was the old days of you put on the shield and you were washed and anointed, and then I remember that 2005, man, that's just gone. Just
yeah,
no more. We're not going to do it. So let me
yeah,
ask you this, right? That kind of takes us up to pretty much modern day, right? 2019, some things happened that really concern me.
yes,
Right. And this is where I hit my point, right? And to be fair, I've already dabbled at this point in, I shouldn't say dabbled. I was living plural marriage for 5 or 6 years. But I, I was more than dabbling. I took that bad boy and dove deep. Anyway,
yeah,
I see the changes that are made, and I'm trying to be super respectful here, but there are some changes that are made that directly affect how the family unit is supposed to function.
yeah, and I have some strong opinions on that.
I'd love to hear that. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically, I don't know exactly what the wording is, but they changed the law of obedience where
That's where I was going. Yep.
yeah, well, where the husband covenants to obey the law of God, and the wife covenants to obey the law of her husband. And my opinion on that is that they totally, I have a lot of things where I love semantics. I love looking at it. So it doesn't say what they think it says in that particular scripture or that particular covenant. I mean, the husband covenants to obey the law of God. The wife isn't covenanting. That doesn't roll off the tongue that easily. The wife isn't making a covenant to obey her husband. She's covenanting to obey the law of her husband. And what's the law of her husband? The law of her husband is the law of God.
Right.
So she's not covenanting. She's not making a covenant I don't know why I'm having a hard time with that word. She's not making a covenant to obey her husband at all. She's making a covenant the same as her husband to obey the law of God. So the change, in my estimation, was redundant because she's already making that covenant, but they have to soften the language because they're trying to keep membership and appease people who are protesting that, who, in my estimation, have completely misunderstood what the covenant is saying.
Absolutely. I remember this was such a hard point for me, and that did crystallize when I did leave. That one instant was enough for me to say, I'm done. I'm done. Now it's a bridge too far. I was willing to live with some of the other stuff once my plural marriage went to hell in a handbasket, and I was willing to go back to the LDS church and be like, I'm just going to sit in the back and I'm just going to do my thing. Didn't work out that way. I always got put into some sort of leadership calling, but
of
course, right? Anyway, excuse me. When that change happened, that was my breaking point. That's when I was like, yeah, we're done, right? At this point, it's becoming a full-out mockery, right? Now, if you didn't know, you wouldn't know, right? If you didn't know what it was supposed to look like, you wouldn't know. But I remember I went in and I talked to my my priesthood leader, so to speak, in the LDS church, and I just said, look, I'm done. And he said, well, why are you done? Can you explain it to me? He's like, Brother Sanders, are you having a faith crisis? I'm like, yes, but not the way you think, right? Like you're gonna be, I believe too much, I think, right? And so I tell him about my problem I have with this, and I remember he looked at me and he said, well, Brother Sanders, I mean, don't you think that covenant could have been used to um, oppress women? I was like, yeah, I think it totally could be used for that.
Absolutely could be, yeah.
But just because that's going on, you don't change a covenant, right? I used to really like to, screw around. And, before I joined the church, full admission, I was a man whore, right? I mean, I was pretty wild, right? You wouldn't change the law of chastity just because you had some men who were struggling to live it. Right? But we're okay doing this. And he didn't have anything to say at that point. But I'm like, it doesn't carry water. And to me, that was the first time I saw something I couldn't kind of explain away, right? Like, okay, this is black and white now. They have far exceeded anything I can do mental gymnastics for.
Right.
So
that was it for you then, huh?
That was it. I was like, later days, peace out, deuces. I'm not participating anymore.
And yeah, that was just 3 years ago. Can you imagine what's next?
Well, like I said, I think you're just going to go up and order a number 7 at a drive-through window. I think that's the logical progression. But okay, so that takes us up to pretty much modern day, right? That's the bulk of where we're at now. A bunch has been taken away, a bunch has been changed. Let's talk about the fallout from that for a second, Moroni. What do you think the fallout is going to be to members of the mainstream LDS church? And let's talk even further back. But what's been the fallout of not participating in those correct ordinances?
Well, as far as consequences, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, I think that it diminishes their priesthood and the endowment that we were talking about from on high that Joseph Smith was. Joseph Smith already laid out the formula for being endowed from on high. What is it that we learn in the temple? We learn how to approach the face of God and communicate directly with them. And you're taking that completely away. I'm not going to be one who's going to say that the church endowment is completely invalid. Because I've heard that among other fundamentalists. I'm not going to say that it's completely invalid because, it says right in Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, that the Lord honors all covenants, contracts, bonds, etc. They're still making a covenant, but I'm not going to lie. I think that it's greatly diminished, and if there is any area where the church has diminished their ability to function in the priesthood, it's in the changing of the ordinances. And it says it right in Isaiah. That they, and of course I'm paraphrasing again, but transgressed the law and changed the ordinance and broke the new and everlasting covenant, broke the everlasting covenant. We like to say, wherefore Isaiah saw our day. Well, Isaiah saw our day. You can't break the everlasting covenant and change the ordinances unless you had them. And
Yep.
Sadly, I think that's exactly where the church is right now.
So it's so interesting to me that as I read back in scripture, right? And you look at human beings back then and you look at human beings now, we're not that much different. I think we like to think we are, right? I think we like to look at folks in the Old Testament who screwed up royally and go, how could they have done that? But I think we're doing it right now, or have up to this point again done the same thing, right? If we go back to Moses, right? And Moses, and Joseph Smith points this out in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, where he's like, come up the mountain with me. You can go see God. You can only come see God with me, right? Come on, let's go. And everyone's like, hell no. You go ahead, Moses. We're good, right? I think it's very much the same thing that we're seeing with the temple now, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in Moses' times, there were certain covenants they would have to fulfill to see the face of God.
Yes.
Likewise, if you look at the entire endowment ceremony, it's doing two things. It's teaching you about Adam God, because realistically, that puts you in your place in relationship to God. And then it's teaching you how to commune with him, right? Again,
exactly.
Let's go up and let's see the face of God. No, I'm good. Thanks, bro. Right? And so we're doing the same thing over again. And it took me a long time to wrap my head around this, because I used to think, okay, so we know in the primitive church and in the Old Testament, New Testament times, and during early on in the Restoration, there's all of these miracles that are being performed. Where are they now? You hear about them anecdotally every once in a while, but not to the scale they were. And it took me forever to make the connection. Well, if we're not living up to the same covenant, I don't think we can expect the same blessing.
Right.
Now, at this point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, at this point, I think I got to say, look, for anyone who doesn't know these things and are making covenants sincerely in an LDS temple, walk up to those covenants, right? You're making those covenants, and there is some effect there.
Yeah, exactly. I think you hit it right on the head. And that's the whole reason we build temples, is so that we can have communion with God face to face. And, why are we messing with the formula?
Right. Well, and to be fair, I think there's a lot of messing with the formula right now, right? I've looked at so I won't say who I work for. Well, most people already know what I do, but I do some work on the Salt Lake Temple, and I saw what they're doing to it. And it occurred to me that we're getting the new Coke of Mormonism right now. You remember old Coke and new Coke and what a disaster it was? I remember.
I'm old enough to remember that.
Yeah, I think we're getting new Coke Mormon, right? I think that's what we're signing up for right now. And it's looking a lot more like just I don't know, just another church, I guess, with some really fancy buildings.
Well, this is the whole purpose of having fundamentalism, because we're a group of people who are trying to keep the old ways, including the endowment, alive on the face of the earth.
Right. You bring up, and that brings me to another question. Do you think there's any group or independent cooperative, so to speak, I guess, that have the original ordinance as it was revealed to Joseph and then perfected by Brigham?
I don't think anybody has anything perfected. I think like Isaiah said, there's vomit on all tables. But and I really can't speak for the experience of a lot of the other groups because I haven't participated in them or in any of their ceremonies. But I come from the AUB, and the AUB for years, a lot of the fundamentalist organizations back then, they believed that their commission was only plural marriage and united order, basically. And they felt that their mandate was not to exceed or do anything that the church was doing in and of itself. So a lot of them would send their children to the LDS church to receive their endowments. And it wasn't until 1978, when the priesthood ban and temple ban was lifted, that they felt, well, hey, maybe we can't send our kids there. And so the AUB started doing the temple ceremony around like 1982. And there's a whole story behind that. They tried to get scripts. They managed to smuggle some scripts from the church. They bought materials from Fred Collier. They did everything that they could to assemble a working script. And basically, it's very similar to the 1877 St. George ceremony, but it's not exactly the same, but it's similar in many respects. And they started doing the endowment from then. And of course, I broke off from the AUB. And so the people that I split off with were doing endowments and had an endowment house. And I've done endowments from inside of living rooms, inside of endowment houses, anywhere and everywhere that we could. And I was set apart as a temple worker for the better part of 20 years. And I've attended endowment ceremonies with other groups. I visited other groups, I saw that the FLDS built a temple over in Texas. And I don't really know what they do in their temple beyond the kind of scary stories that I hear. But every time I've ever talked to somebody from the FLDS, they really don't understand almost anything about temple work. And I went up to visit Winston Blackmore's group up in Canada several years ago. And I talked to some of the young people there that I was visiting, and they didn't know anything about any endowments. And the way they view it is that in the FLDS, that whatever version of the endowment they had, was for the elite only. And so they have kind of written off temple work as something unnecessary because it's something that Warren Jeffs was doing among his elite. So, I know that some of the people from the LeBaron tradition, like specifically the Ross LeBaron tradition, have been doing a type of endowment for a while. I know that Christ Church has been doing an endowment. So I am familiar that some people are perpetuating these things, but I don't know to what degree and to what level. And, because there's an awful lot of fundamentalists that don't do any sort of endowment work. And I myself haven't done any endowment work for about 7 years now, just because I'm completely isolated. And
so, in your mind, where you kind of think, okay, nobody has it the way it probably should be overall, right? They can get it close, probably. They can dial it in kind of tight. At what point do you see that getting fixed? Or do you think that there is maybe criteria within the endowment that is like absolutely necessary and then everything else can be kind of negotiable? I mean, what do you see there? How does that work for you in your mind?
well, I think that if we're going to correct the endowment, we have to have a place built where the Lord can come and correct us. And that's kind of me making that statement is a lot more controversial in a lot of fundamentalist circles than a lot of people realize. Excuse me. In the AUB, they built a temple down in Mexico. They have an endowment house in Salt Lake, but they are still afraid to move forward and do more temple work because they still cling to the Bully Commission of don't do anything that the church is doing. And, they pray for the temple doors to be open. And I've always been of the opinion that Mormons are always a temple building people. And, if we build temples, is that not having the temple doors open to us if we build our own? But, if we were going to be set in order, got to have a place where the Lord can come and direct us first. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah. I think you're probably right in the sense that, look, I think when the Lord comes down to correct his people, I think there's going to be a lot of mainstream LDS people. I think there's going to be a lot of fundamentalists, and everywhere in between where we're all like, ooh, yeah, I probably screwed that one up, right? That one's on me. So I tend to be a little more inclusive on this than perhaps a lot of other people that I associate with or whatever, because I think I just don't know if at this point we can get it exactly back to what it was in 1877. Right. I think that it's just not going to happen. Now, having said that, because of things I read in scripture and certain things I have felt during prayer, I think that the Lord just doesn't deal with the X's and O's of any certain script, right? I think he's looking at the heart a little bit here, and this is where we have to.
I think so too.
I think this is where we have to have faith that, okay, is it better to not participate at all because you don't have a perfect understanding, or is it better to at least make those covenants with God, and then that at least puts you in a position to be schooled along the way, right? Wherever that leads,
right?
And
right, you have to maintain the spirit of the law.
Exactly. And so I think sometimes out of probably just apprehension, right? Like, gosh, I'm not sure I should be doing this outside of sanctioned areas, that we kind of cut ourselves off a little bit.
Well, I think generally among most fundamentalists I've known, they are afraid to err on the side of doing too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm more afraid of erring on the side of doing too little.
I would agree with you. Joseph Smith said, "No man will ever be damned because he believed too much."
Right.
Are you there?
Yeah, you blanked out for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I kind of err on the side of approach the Lord, right?
Yeah.
We saw what happened with the children of Israel. That didn't pan out well. I think we just need to approach the Lord more.
Yeah. So I think that we probably need to talk about the biggest change in the temple, for me anyway.
Yeah, we're here. So
should we get into it?
All right, folks, buckle up. Here we go. All right, so in your opinion,
it's like the monkey on our back, so to speak.
It really is. It's the elephant in the room. It's the one that everybody, whether you're mainstream LDS, whether you're a fundamentalist, there is a certain amount of cringe to this next subject, right? And I've always said, just own it, right? Let's just get it out there. Let's flush it out and let's go with it. So what is that to you, Moroni? What is that?
Well, that would have to, the biggest change of the temple would be 1978, the lifting of the priesthood ban and the temple ban upon people of the African persuasion.
Well, no one wants to talk about this.
No, everybody clams up about it, and everybody avoids the subject. And I'm a firm believer that it needs to be addressed directly and confronted directly.
Right.
We can't. We're so afraid. And I think that generally Mormons are very passive aggressive, and they don't like saying things overtly that might be offensive. And so their remedy is to just not talk about it, ignore it.
We are kind of a dysfunctional family in that way, right?
Right.
We really are. Rather than just have that awkward, uncomfortable conversation, we're totally cool with just letting it sit for this Thanksgiving, and we'll have it next Thanksgiving. So, but look, I'm sure I'm going to say some things here that is going to get me in some trouble, and I don't look. I made a promise to God a long time ago that I was going to follow truth no matter where it went, right?
Yeah.
And if this is one of those things that I have to die on this hill, so be it. I'm ready for that. So in 1978, prior to let's back up here, and I'm going to kind of sum up to 1978, and you can tell me if I'm incorrect here. Prior to Brigham Young's tenure as president of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith did in fact ordain two men of African descent. One was Elijah Abel. Who was the other?
Walker Lewis, I believe.
Walker Lewis, thank you. To the priesthood.
Yes.
Brigham Young then becomes prophet of the LDS Church. And he then places a ban that no longer can men of African descent be given the priesthood or enter the temple. And then that takes root and holds all the way to 1978. And then in 1978, the LDS Church then goes in and says, that's over. Now African American men can hold the priesthood and they can enter the temple.
Yes.
If you're comfortable, tell me what your thoughts are on that whole history and where we are now.
Okay. Well, you and I have kind of talked a little bit about this, and I think it's pretty hard to tell my thoughts on this without telling my story,
right,
of what I went through, and I'm willing to do that, even though it's kind of difficult to get this out. So 1978, the ban on blacks holding the priesthood and entering the temple is lifted. For my dad, you talked about how 2019 was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back for you. For my dad, it was 1978. He had been raised in the church. He was a temple-going Mormon, but he had fundamentalist leanings, and when that happened, he stopped attending. He never went to the temple again after that. And he attended church for about another 10 years before his excommunication. But and I used to tell my dad, I'd say, why do I have to go to church? You don't go to church. And he'd say, well, son, until you've studied as much into the gospel as I have, you have to go to church. He says, until that time that you've studied as much as I have, you just have to go. And anyway, so we become fundamentalists. Okay. And one of the first experiences I associated with some independents before I joined the AUB. And I know that my friend Sean Anderson on one of your recent posts talked a little bit about the same time period, because we went through it. We experienced huge amounts of racism because we're mixed race. We're both half Mexican. We both have white fathers and Mexican mothers. And so growing up in Arizona, I had never experienced being on the receiving end of racism until I moved to Utah. And I have to say, even though my dad believed in the priesthood ban, he always taught us to respect other people of other races. He didn't tolerate any, he didn't tolerate us saying the N-word or anything like that. And then I get to Utah, and it's the N-word just about every other word coming out of a lot of people's mouths, and that was hard for me. That was really, really hard for me. So anyway, so we joined the AUB and broke off from the AUB, went out on our own. We had a small community gathered in Arizona. I was living in a United Order back then. And we had a family that came trying to communicate with us. And it was a guy who was in the AUB, but he had met online a lady of Polynesian descent. She was half Samoan and half Maori. And while he was in the AUB, he tried to get himself sealed to this woman. But the priesthood council in the AUB was bouncing back and forth on whether they should seal her or not. Now, I had grown up in an area that didn't have any Polynesians. When I got to Utah, all the fundamentalists were saying that the Polynesians fell under the curse of Cain, just like the Africans did. And because I didn't know any better, I just went along with it. Okay, they kind of look like they do, So anyway, my dad was alive at the time, so this guy got a hold of me. He wanted to have a sealing performed for this woman from New Zealand who was of Polynesian descent. So I took it to my dad, and my dad kind of just said, well, he said, this is a sticky situation. He said, it would be better if we kind of just left this one alone. So I actually wrote this guy back and said, sorry, you don't have a place here with us. And then my dad passed away in the interim. And then this guy kept writing to me and basically pleading to come and have fellowship with us. He had been thrown out of the AUB. He wanted to be sealed. And so he said something that resonated with me. He said, all I tried to get from the AUB was righteous judgment, and they wouldn't give it to me. And when he said that, that resonated with me that, yeah, we did have to judge this situation accordingly. So I invited him out. So he showed up at one of our conferences. And when I saw his car pull up, we were all standing outside of our building, our chapel house, and we were watching him pull up. And he got out of the car, this white dude. And then his Polynesian wife gets out of the car. And I took one look at her, and I thought, oh, there's no problem there at all. But I guess a lot of other people in our community, even family members of mine, took one look at her and they thought the opposite. They saw Canaanite, and so there was a debate that instantly ensued in our community about whether or not to accept them in our community. And so they moved to the area. And honestly, we took too long in making a decision. They were there for 3 years and nobody was making a decision as to whether to fully fellowship them or not. And so I was a young man, and so I was assigned by our priesthood council to investigate the situation. And so I started studying history, church history specifically. And I was researching the fact that the Polynesians have a long history in the LDS Church. That Joseph Smith sent missionaries to the Cook Islands shortly after the church was founded. Brigham Young sent missionaries to Tonga. And by the way, this woman, she also had children that their father was Tongan. And their children were teenagers, and they were associating with our young people. And so, I came across lots of things. Church history in Tonga, where Tongans and people in the Cook Islands, when the missionaries were forced for whatever reason to pull out of those areas, that they left priesthood leadership in charge. And those saints gathered, a lot of those Tongan saints gathered to Utah and moved to Tooele. And, so you would think that if there was a problem with their lineage, like the fundamentalists were teaching, that would have come up a long time ago with Brigham Young and other people that were teaching. So I even went to New Zealand. This couple invited me to New Zealand with them, and I went to like a South Pacific anthropological museum. I went to the Hamilton Temple in New Zealand, and I photocopied in the lobby. They had different testimonies of different Maori people who had prophecies that the priesthood would come into their midst, and they had these prophecies for like almost 50 years before the first Mormon missionaries showed up. And so what I did is that I assembled this packet of information that I had gathered in New Zealand and that I had gathered in church history books, and I presented this information to our priesthood council. And when I gave it to them, they completely rejected the information, all except for one man. And this particular man had a stepson who was engaged to one of these Polynesian girls. And so he got the idea to do a DNA test. And so when he did the DNA test on one of these Polynesian girls, it turned out that they were, I can't remember the exact percentages, but it was like 30% European, 30% Asian, 20% Native American, 0% Sub-Saharan African. I don't remember the exact percentages, but it was 0% Sub-Saharan African. So that showed us right there that there was no question with them being Canaanite, so to speak. And what happened is that a wedding was performed, a sealing was performed for this couple. And what ensued was, we used to have a chapel, and the upper floor of the chapel had a prayer room where we would meet every Sunday and perform the true order prayer. And when we got there, that the locks had just been changed. It was like a super passive aggressive move. That's how we were informed that we were excommunicated. They just changed the locks so that none of us could get into the prayer room. And then they released all of us from our callings. They released my wife, who had been primary president for 10 years, from her calling without even telling her. I had been a Sunday school teacher for the youth for 10 years. They released me, just called somebody else to the position. And so we found ourselves completely separated because we had invited a Polynesian family into our midst. And it was painful for me because there were members of my family that were on the other side of this split. Okay. But it was worth it for me because I learned something about Polynesian culture and church history in that regard. And so that lesson was valuable to me. So years later, the person who had done the DNA test started suggesting that we do the DNA test on ourselves. And so we did a DNA test on my daughter. Sent the DNA test, and this part sounds a little bit weird, but I'm going to tell it anyway. But after we turned the DNA test, my wife and I went to Utah for a family reunion, and on the way back, we stopped by Rockland Ranch. And at Rockland Ranch, we were guests at somebody's house, and they put us back. This is where they have the homes that are drilled out of the rocks. They're basically so anyway, they invited us. To stay in one of their back bedrooms. And when I say that this room was dark, there was no windows. You're in a cave. It was 100% black. It was like being in a sensory deprivation tank. So that night,
which I've always wanted to do, by the way. I mean, that to me sounds absolutely awesome. But
I'd like it too. If I could just get over the claustrophobia thing.
Right. No, those sound cool. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. So anyway, that night I had an experience, one of the only experiences that I've had, and I don't know whether it was an angel or a spirit or something, but a woman came to me, and I was awake because I sat up in bed for this experience, and I touched my eyeballs to make sure I was awake. But there was a woman standing at my bedside dressed in white, and she had like a glow around her. And she never said anything to me, but she kept showing me certain scenes. She showed me several scenes, most of them which I didn't remember, but there were three that I did. And each scene she showed me three times. And the first one was a skull. And then the next one was a room full of people, and you could see people as far back as you could, as far back as the eye could see. And then the next thing she showed me was a line of sand coming out of the sky, and as soon as the sand hit the ground, it started tracing a spiral pattern. And after she showed me each scene, she would look at me with significance. She wouldn't say anything, but she'd give me like a meaningful look, like, "You get it, you get it, you get what I'm showing you." And so after the experience ended, I wasn't scared. I rolled over and went to sleep. And the next morning, I didn't have any phone range, any cell service in the cave. So as soon as we left and we're driving down the road, I called a good friend of mine who's really good at dream interpretation. She's not even Mormon. I said, "Okay, I had this experience. Can you tell me what it means? Can you interpret this for me?" And she said, "Okay." She said, so I said, "The skull, that's got to mean death, right? Skull means death." And she said, "Actually, no." She said, "That could actually mean knowledge." I said, "Okay." I said, "What about the room full of people?" And she said, "That's your ancestors." And I said, "Okay, the sand coming out of the sky tracing the spiral pattern on the ground." And she said, "Oh, that's easy. That's DNA." And I said, "Huh, okay." So we drove from Rockland Ranch back to Arizona, and we got back right as the sun was starting to set. And the first thing is that we did is I pulled up to the house, and the man who had done the DNA test was waiting on the porch with my DNA results in hand. And so I'm like, okay. And when I looked at it, it's like my heart sank because I'm Mexican. My wife is Japanese, and it came up, certain percent Native American, certain percent Asian, and then it came up a certain percent Nigerian, and my heart sank when I saw that, and I was like, that can't be. I know I hold the priesthood, and so I went home that night, and I remember I tossed and turned all night, and everything to me at that point felt like a lie that I had, quote, Canaanite blood, and and of course most Mormon fundamentalists believe in the one drop rule. So I'm thinking, gosh, everything that I've ever believed is a lie, and it went on like that for 2 nights. 2 nights I was tossing and turning and just disturbed by this, and then I started remembering. The Lord brought to mind instances in my life where I had experienced directly the priesthood and my use of the priesthood, and I started remembering different things, and I remember that some in my family had the attitude, well, the DNA test is wrong because I know I hold the priesthood, and my attitude was, well, I know I hold the priesthood. I know I hold the priesthood because, I know that I hold the priesthood in spite of the DNA evidence. Even though, whether it's true or not true, I know that I hold the priesthood. And so that got me to start to question things. And so anyway, so what happened in our community is that some in our community started to take a dim view at it. They wanted to start excluding us from priesthood functions. So we met as a community. Every endowed member of our community met together to decide what to do about it, and we came to the conclusion that we should until there's evidence one way or the other that we should be able to continue to function in the priesthood, and but some in the community didn't like that. Some kind of started trying to take measures to prevent us from participating. And so I started, what this did is it created an impetus for me to start studying the priesthood ban, why it was implemented, how it was implemented. And I found that things are not as we think as far as the priesthood ban. That, like you brought up, Walker Lewis and Elijah Abel. These are men that were very obviously ordained to the priesthood, and Elijah Abel functioned in the priesthood way into the latter half of the 19th century in Salt Lake. He was still listed in the rolls as a 70. His priesthood was never rescinded. Now, some fundamentalists will tell you that it was, but I started researching what happened, and I couldn't find any evidence that Joseph Smith had directly taught a restriction on priesthood for people of the African race. I couldn't find it at all. There were things that I thought had said that, like Pearl of Great Price, but the more you examine it, it doesn't say exactly what we think it says. It says that Pharaoh, who was the son of Egyptus, that he was of that race that was cursed pertaining to the priesthood, comma, not having the rights to the priesthood. I used to think that meant that they had no right at all to hold the priesthood, but that's not what it says at all. If you look at it, it says that they didn't have the rights to the priesthood, which, according to Hebraic tradition, indicates birthright. So they were just not of the birthright lineage, but it doesn't say anything about them being restricted from holding the priesthood. And so I started researching more. I saw that Brigham Young, they had a territorial legislation session in 1852 in Utah to try to decide whether or not they were going to continue with slavery. Orson Pratt, who didn't believe in generational curses, was fiercely against slavery. And I believe that Brigham Young, when he made that speech in 1852 about the blacks not holding priesthood, that it was a knee-jerk reaction to him being upset with Orson Pratt. I'm convinced of it, that he was just, well, Orson Pratt says this, well, guess what? They can't hold the priesthood. And then you jump forward to, I can't remember the year, it's either 1872 or 1874. They revisited it, and they did a test case among the saints, and they tried to establish that Joseph Smith had taught it, and they hinged their testimony around Zebedee Coltrane's testimony. And if you examine Zebedee Coltrane's testimony about Joseph Smith teaching it, he doesn't even say that he heard Joseph Smith teach it. He said that he was going to, when he was on his way to Zion's camp in Missouri, that he heard another brother say that Joseph Smith had taught it. So it's hearsay. And in Mormonism, we talk about all things established by the mouth of two or more witnesses. And yet, Zebedee Coltrane's hearsay was enough to basically establish this. And my opinion is, I have more questions than I do answers in regard to this. I'm still trying to study this out. I'm still trying to figure it out. But, if the salvation and exaltation of an entire race of people are hinging in the balance, then we deserve it to them and to each other to ask the hard questions and finally put this whole question to the test and have discussions about it. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. We need to talk about it because it's not cut and dry. It's not super clear.
No. And here's where I'm going to go renegade once again, right? If I'm a guy that just sits down and looks at the evidence,
yeah,
the evidence weighs against this idea of a priesthood and temple ban. It just does. I think you're right in the sense that I think, and this pains me to say because I love Brigham. I identify more with Brigham than I can with Joseph, because Joseph is like way better than I am, and I can see some faults in Brigham, right? Just because he he's short-tempered like I can be, and stubborn like I can be.
Yeah.
But what you said about a knee-jerk reaction totally makes sense. Let's not forget, Brigham and Orson are fighting over the Adam God doctrine at this very same moment, right?
Right.
And
That's right.
we have to have these conversations, because otherwise we're doing what some of the Lamanites did in the Book of Mormon, where we just hold to vain traditions because they're traditions.
Yeah.
And I feel like that these conversations are crucial. I also think we have to be, you know, honest with ourselves and our history and looking at it, right?
Yeah.
And we have to question with intent of getting the right answer, not the answer we want.
Yeah.
Because
Dude, you're a Renaissance man.
because if we start from the supposition of this has always been true, and we're going to hold to whatever this is, we will find a way to justify it. I'm walking proof of that. I justified staying in the LDS church way too long with a series of mental gymnastics that would make any gold medalist envious. And not in some respects, in every respect, I am where I am now because of a pursuit of truth.
Yes.
Right? And if that puts me on the outside looking in, I'll take it. Because I can at least stand before God with a clear conscience and say, I didn't buckle.
Yeah.
On this, I stood.
Well, I think if people are offended or unwilling to ask the hard questions, then most likely they're not approaching their belief in this from a confident standpoint to begin with.
No,
and see, that's where I'm at. You know, it's like I'm totally independent right now because I don't know, given the results of my DNA tests, if any community would really feel comfortable having me. And I may be, you know, I may be not giving people credit enough, but it's a hard thing to deal with, you know. So
it is. But I think you look, if you came to the same conclusion that you talked about, in some ways, Moroni, you are perfectly placed to talk about these things, because not
yes.
only are you a strong Mormon fundamentalist with a lot of knowledge, with a lot of Mormon cred, if you will, but now you've been on the other side of this thing looking in.
Yes.
Right? That
yeah,
gives
and you're the first person that I've really talked to publicly about this.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do. I appreciate the vote of confidence. But I think you're uniquely positioned to talk about this, right? Because you've had to walk that road. So, and here's the other thing, right? As fundamentalists, we're scattered pretty far and wide, right?
Yeah.
And so, unlike the LDS church that can just make a policy change and you're all good, now we have to be able to do this by individual, right? Which is what this is really boiling down to, is on a basis by basis family. Make the case and then just let it go.
Like what Brigham Young said, each of us has to stand on our own tub.
Exactly. So, and this is the interesting part of my journey, and I can only imagine what it was like for you, is the fact that, you know, I come into fundamentalism and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to hold to the truth, right?
Yeah.
And in fundamentalism, there should be nothing but truth. And then you find, well, maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe we're holding to some traditions because they were traditions, period.
Well, I think that fundamentalists do that a lot. We take what Brigham Young says, everything he says is gospel. We take everything Lauren Woolley says or Rulon Ulrich says, and we forget that they were men and they were capable of error also. You know, we don't need to deify them. we can, we can examine what they said and then decide for ourselves whether we accept those or not.
And I think it's important to realize that unlike the LDS Church, we now have the ability to question a few things, right?
Yeah.
We are perfectly positioned to say Brigham Young was a prophet, and it's entirely possible that Brigham Young was wrong on this issue.
Yeah.
And
that's precisely where I'm at.
Yeah, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Be able to say, okay, this doesn't hold water from simply a historical standpoint, right? As fundamentalists, one of the main arguments you always hear is the waters are purest at their source, right? Meaning, no, we're going back all the way to Joseph Smith. Are you? Are you? Really? Right? Now, because then it gets uncomfortable, right? So, if we're going to take that stance, then we kind of have to question with a sense of boldness, right? And not be scared of the answer. Understand it's going to suck, right? Because it may upend some things that you believe.
Yeah.
But it's totally worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. It's been a long, strange trip.
I bet. So let's talk about that a little bit now. You're in this very unique space where you are, again, your Mormon cred is off the charts, right? You are like, well, you've been my favorite for a lot of years, just because I like the whole angle of the punk rock.
Well, I don't know about Mormon cred, but I'll take it.
You're very well spoken in your articles. You're very well written. But now you've seen this on the other side, and you feel like you don't know where you fit. So what's the answer for you?
Boy, you're going to have me on again when I figure that out, because it's a day-by-day thing, like I said, I have more questions, on what to do next. It's been kind of a lonely journey. I've been to a few communities, and I've been opened fairly warmly by a lot of these communities, but the question is always in the back of my mind, they're going to find out about this. And of course, especially now that I've done a podcast about it, but how are they going to take it? How are they going to accept it? And in some ways I feel that it's unfair to impose myself on people knowing how they might feel. So it's kind of like stumbling in the dark a little bit. I need to find my way personally through this. And like I said, maybe you'll have me back some other time when I got that figured out.
Absolutely. Look, I've always said, anyone who's come on here before has a standing invitation. You just got to call me. So you can always come
thank
back.
You. Thanks.
And dude, I'm more than willing to associate with you on anything and everything.
Well, I appreciate that.
I really do. I think the world of you, Moroni. I can't stress that enough. And we've talked about some pretty hard things here, right? Especially at the end, as you shared your story, which is, dude, I'm honored you did it on this podcast.
And I'm going to be talking about this at Sunstone too.
Are you?
Yeah. So I'm going to be talking on this very topic with Christina Rossetti, who she's a Mormon studies professor from Dixie College, or Dixie University, I guess it is now.
Right.
And
right
she just wrote a paper on this topic also. So we figured that both of us could probably bring some light to this subject, and that we would complement each other as far as our presentation. So I don't know what day yet, but it's going to be at the symposium at some point.
Right.
She should.
Yeah, no.
Well, my battery's about ready to die, so
okay.
we probably need to wrap it up.
Yep, let me wrap it up. So, Moroni, dude, again, I can't tell you how much it means that you were here, and then you bore your soul here, dude. I mean,
Thanks.
That I've always said, that takes the biggest set of nuts, bar none, is to throw your voice out there in the ether and have it heard by people. And your name alone is going to draw folks. So I really appreciate what you did there. Well,
thank you. It's taken me 5 years. It's taken me 5 years to get to the point where I could talk about this.
Well, I'm honored it was here, and it doesn't speak highly enough of the courage that you just showed. It's huge. All right, everybody. Bye.
Bye.